Giving back to people out in fields.
All right, we'll say good morning, or good Ner Yom Tov. Such a schus Baruch Hashem to be able to go into Rosh Hashanah together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank the Tilsa Mishpacha, our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei Hey. Incredible. I will say sometimes, when you have something annual, you feel it's going to last our annual so long, and then you get to the end of the annual, and you recognize the profundity of the passage of time. So we express our tremendous hakaras hatov to the Tilsa Mishpacha for dedicating all of the Torah this year as a zchus for Besoros Tovos and Misal and Halavai. We should Meretz Hashem see that zchus Mekuyim in Meretz Hashem in the year to come. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Alim L'Tov, on this last day of Elul, Ben Gober Faliyef and the Shemus of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Tegar Ezel Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that in Meretz Hashem the tefillos of our Kila and all of Klais will be answered. Shmuley Eli Bedinovitz Leilu Nishmas David Flom's father, Rabbi Ari Flom, Rabbi Yitzchak Aryeh ben Hachava, Rabbi Yaakov Zichron Lebracha, and our week of learning sponsors, Jonathan and Alana Austin, in honor of the engagement of Eretz Yisrael, in honor of the engagement of their daughter Tamar Tiair Ashendorf from Teaneck, New Jersey. Beautiful. May they be zocha to build the Bayis Tamim B'Yisrael, and how beautiful it is, Baruch Hashem, to end off this year with a simcha, with a chasen and kala, with a mazel tov. Chasen and kala should be zocha Hashem to build the Bayis Tamim B'Yisrael and have many years filled with mazel, bracha, simcha, and hatzlacha. And Meretz Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bring our hostages home to Shalom Makarbal, our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol Maaseh Yedeim, and all of Am Yisrael should be zocha to Aksiva v'chasima tova. With that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, not a lot of time. I promised a finish time between 8 and 9 a.m. So I'm gonna make good on that. And we're closer to 8. So let's go. So today's daf is daf Ches 8. Picking up in Meretz Hashem on the bottom of Zayin Amud Beis. Thank you to Ramil for pushing me to the 2 dots yesterday. Second line from the bottom. 2 lines up from the bottom. Chatas Milan. So remember again, the Gemara now is journeying through the Mishnah. So the Mishnah explained that halacha l'maisa. Normally the halacha is as follows: that when you have a karban, if the karban is offered up not lishma, for the sake of a different karban or shinui bailin, normally the halacha is the karban itself is going to be kosher, but ultimately will not count towards the obligation of the owner. There are 2 exceptions to this rule. 2 exceptions are chatas and pesach. So the Gemara is now going through each of these. Chatas minalan. From where do I know that if a chatas is offered up shelo lishma, that not only does it not count towards the obligation of the owner, but that halacha l'maisa, again, the karban itself is an invalid karban. From where do I know that? Ultimately, again, because the pasuk says, also, you've seen this so many times, v'shachat osa l'chatos, you shall shecht it for a chatos. So halacha l'maisa, the shchita itself has to be l'shem chatos. Ashkechon shchita, so that tells me shchita, kabbalah minal. And from where do I know kabbalah? So the Gemara says, Dichsev, top of Ches 8a, v'lakach hakoin midam hachatos, shetehei kabbalah l'shem chatos. So what says? So the pasuk says the coin will take from the dam hachatos. So from here you see that again, there's a reference to the kabbalah, to the receiving of the blood. So the kabbalah also has to be done lishma. V'yashkichon shchita v'kabbalah. So now I know shchita and kabbalah have to be done lishma. Zrika minal. And how do I know that zrika has to be done lishma? We'll say 3rd line down from the top, 8a, chesed aleph d'amakra. The pasuk says the coin will go ahead and atone mechatoso shete kapara the shem chatos. That the kapara, the atonement, has to be the shem chatos. And I both say, now remember again in karbanos, what affects the kapara? It's the zrika, it's the sprinkling of the blood. So same idea over here. So essentially you keep seeing the same type of drasha over and over and over, where the Torah is making an additional kind of almost like insistence, lechatos, mechatos. So from here you see that the zrika, the sprinkling, also has to be done l'shma. Incredible. So ashkechan shinui kodesh. So both say, so now I understand that a chatas has to be done l'shma. But what type of l'shma? What we'll call a l'shma of kodesh, which means it has to be offered up for the particular carbon, for the particular carbonic designation. Shinui baila minalam. How do I know that the carbon, in order to be effective, has to be offered up for the sake of the specific owners and can't have a kavana for a change in ownership? Amakra alav. Therefore, the pasuk says alav. The chatas is for him. Alav. Alav v'lo achavero. Chatas only works for the intended owner and not for his friend. Ashkechon l'mitzvah. So now I understand that ideally, the mitzvah means this is the ideal. That's when offering up a chatas should be offered up for its intended owner. La'akev minalan. But remember, again, I will say, what the Mishnah introduced us to is, look, by all karbanos, l'chatchila, you want it to be l'shma. Right? I want it to be the Shema for carbonic designation. I want it to be the Shema for the ownership designation. So fine, Chatas is no different than that in that respect. But what the Mishnah is introducing me to is that by Chatas, it's La'akev. La'akev means what? That halacha l'maisa, if you don't have the Shema, either by carbonic designation or you don't have the Shema by ownership designation, that the carbon is invalid. From where do I know that? So the Gemara says, Ashkechon l'mitzvah la'akim yal kidam rafuna b'rei Rav Yeshua chatos chataso. So we'll say achanami chatos chataso. So we'll say interesting enough. The Gemara suggests where are we learning this out from? We're learning this out from the chatos of the Nazir. If you take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says chataso. It's in the short lines of Rashi, 3 lines in chataso. V'chipra lava koin me chataso kishezarak down the shmuel chatas chataso midahavle lemichtav me chatas uksiv vav yisir lemedrash be bailim. So ultimately, again, I will say. So once again, we're dashing over here. It could have just said chatos, but instead it says chataso. So this, by the way, this pasuk is written by Chatas Nazir, which we'll get to in just a moment. But Chataso is again possessive, telling you that what? In order for the carbon to be effective, it must be shechted for the purpose or for the designation of this particular owner. Therefore, we see from here that halacha l'maisa, it's la'akev. It's la'akev, that ultimately it's not just that you need the shema l'chatchila, but failure to have the shema actually undermines the effectiveness of the carbon. So Ashkechan mitzvah, listen to this. Ashkechan mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh. Zrika b'shinoi bailim bein l'mitzvah bein la'akev. So it says, here's now interesting, here's what I have. So now I have that halacha l'maisa l'chatchila, you have to have the correct carbonic designation. I also know that halacha l'maisa, if you do zrika for the wrong owner, then it compromises the carbon. La'akiv b'chol avodos b'shinoi kodesh u'b'shar avodos b'shinoi bailim bein l'mitzvah bein la'akiv minalan. But how do I know ultimately, again, by all other parts of the carbonic service, that if you have shinoi kodesh, a change in carbonic designation, that it compromises the carbon? Or for that matter, again, when it comes to shinoi bailim and changing in ownership designation, how do I know that if you do that by a chatos, it undermines the chatos? Ultimately, again, we learn it out from the chatas of the Nazir. Dichsiv, v'hikri v'koin lifnei Hashem, v'asas chataso v'es oloso. Because the pasuk says the coin will offer it up before Hashem, and he will do his chataso v'es oloso. So we'll say, so remember, I want to point out what's happening over here. The Gemara is really focusing on the fact that whenever you see chatas, it's always phrased in the possessive, chataso. Chataso. So when you see chataso, the Gemara is understanding this to mean that in order for the chatas to be effective, it has to be done l'shma. Again, what does l'shma mean? 2 forms of l'shma. Right, l'shma for carbonic designation, l'shma for ownership designation. Or the Gemara says, so so from here you see everything done for the carbon has to be done l'shem chatos. Ashkechon shinui kodesh, shinui bailim. So now both says, now I understand shinui kodesh. Okay, so once again, I understand that the carbon has to be offered up for its particular carbonic designation. Shinui bailim. But how do I know that halacha l'maisa, the carbon also has to be offered up for the sake of its particular owner? The Gemara says, so we can skip around this actually. Once again, because the pasuk could have just said chatos, the fact that it says chatos so possessive indicates to us what? That in order for the carbon to be effective, it has to be offered up for that particular owner. Maski for Ravina. We will say, by the way, I know the Gemara could sound like a little bit confusing, a lot of back and forth. This is one of these Gemaras where what's the good news? The good news is everyone agrees on the conclusion, right? There's no machlokas about the conclusion, which means everyone agrees that a chatos is unique in that in order for a chatos to be kosher, it has to ultimately have lishma. Lishma meaning has to be carbonic designation. You have to have in mind for carbon chatas, right? Carbonic designation and for ownership designation. And failure to have lishma in either of those two areas makes the chatas pasul. The chatas itself is an invalid carbon if that happens. Not just that it doesn't count for the owner, but it's fundamentally pasul. And everyone agrees with that fact. Everyone agrees with that. All the Gemara is doing over here now is trying to figure out from where do we know that. So the Gemara says, Maskef Ravina. So Rabbi say, so really, interestingly enough, so much of the drasha by chatas really comes down to chataso. Chataso, the possessive form of this, to indicate us that the chatas ultimately again has to be done lishma. So Maskef Ravina elemi ata olas. So my darash tabei. Here's the problem. The Torah uses this emotion by ola. By ola. It could have just said olas, but it says olas so. So what do you do with that possessive? So the Gemara says, Ul-Rabina, minchaso, nesech nisko, so my darshibuhu. So I'll say, here's the problem. If the Torah would only say by chataso, then I'd hear. But that's not the case. The Torah uses this same type of verbiage by a lot of other kabbalos as well. To which the Gemara says, "Ahumi baile min chasam miniskehem balayla, min chasam miniskem afilu lemachar." So at least I will say for some of it, ultimately teaches us other halachas. Let's say, for example, by the mincha and nesachim. Mincha is the meal offering. Nesachim is wine libations that accompanies certain karbanos. So the additional lashon teaches us that as much as the carbon itself must be offered up by day, these supplemental carbonic accessories can be offered up at night. This is very interesting. Sometimes even the mincha and the nesachim, the meal offerings and the wine libations, can even be offered up the next day. But ultimately, what do you do with olas? In other words, they will say, what do you do with the possessive of olas? What does that teach me? To which the Gemara says, furthermore, again, are we actually able to learn out these things from chatas nazir? So we're going to see right now that there's a number of different cases of chatas. So remember again, the lashon of chataso that the Gemara is darshaning everything from, right? Because remember, the ikar drasha over is chataso, his chatas, which the Gemara is using to teach me what? Lishma. That it's got to be done for the sake of chatas. What has to be done for the sake of chatas? The carbon has to be up for number one, for lishma, for kodesh, for chatas designation, and chataso for the particular owner. And all of this is learned out from chatas nazir. Remember, everyone say nazir, the Nazarite, when he comes to he finishes, he abstains from drinking wine, eating grapes, coming in contact with the dead. When he finishes the duration of his Nazarite vow, he brings a series of karbanos, amongst them a karban chatas, a sin offering. So we're learning out now all of the halachas of chatas from his chatas. The Gemara now says, hold up. Can you really learn out these chatas offerings from the chatas nazir? Why? Listen to this. So chatas chela mi chatas nazir lo gamra. So we'll say, so again, for example, so not the chatas of chela. Chela is forbidden fat. Right? If you go ahead and you eat forbidden fat intentionally, you're chayiv kares. You do it unintentionally, you bring a carbon chatas. So the Gemara says something very interesting. I can't really learn out chatas chela from chatas nazir. Why? Sheken yesh ima damim achirim. Because the chatas of a nazir has other accompanying karbanos which come along with it. Chatas nazir me chatas chelev lo gamra. Furthermore, I can't learn out chatas nazir from chatas chelev. Why not? Shekain kares. Because ultimately, again, I will say, remember again, chelev is a kares bearing infraction. Rava says, Asya me chatas mitzora. Interesting. Perhaps where we learn out the source for, again, the din of lishma by chatos is actually the chatos of a mitzora, right? Person is stricken with saras. There's a purification process. Part of his purification process is that he brings a carbon chatos. We could dash like this. The kohen will do the chatos, which indicates to us what? All steps of the chatas must be done lishma. So why don't we say, just like the chatas of the mitzora has to be done lishma? And I've also remember again, whenever we say lishma, what does lishma refer to? What does lishma refer to? Two forms of lishma. Carbonic lishma, ownership lishma. So say the same way that chatas mitzora has to be done lishma, so too all other forms ultimately again, all other chatas offerings also have to be done lishma, to which the Gemara says, shinui kodesh. So fine. So that teaches me that you need carbonic designation. Ultimately, again, shinui bailam minale. How do I know that halacha also need ownership l'shma. So the verse Amar Kra, the chiper ala mitaher. The pasuk says it will atone for the one who is being purified. Ala mitaher zeh, v'lo ala mitaher chavero. And only who does the carbon? Who does the carbon work for? Only for the individual who is the owner of that carbon, the intended object of the purification and atonement, but not for someone else. So that teaches me again that there must be ownership l'shma as well. V'akati miyalfi me'adadi, but still, can you learn out? So we'll say, so essentially what we're trying to do over here is, originally we thought we were learning out the din of l'shma from Chatas Nazir. Then it turns out the Gemara says, no, you can't do that because Chatas Nazir is too dissimilar to other cases of Chatas. Fine, so the Gemara says, we'll learn it out from Chatas Mitzora, but still says, the Gemara, can you do that? After all, Chatas Chel mi Chatas Mitzora lo yalfa, I counter not the Chatas of Chelev from the Chatas of Mitzora. Why not? Sheken yesh imad damim achirim. Because remember again, when the Mitzora brings his Chatas, he brings other karbanos as well. Chatas mitzvah me chatas chelev lo gamra, and I can't remember chatas mitzvah from chatas chelev. Why not? Shekin kares. Ultimately, again, because there is a din of kares by chelev, and that doesn't apply in other cases. So I'll say, so where am I learning it out from? So this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, mechada lo asya. So the truth is, it could very well be that perhaps. So I just want to point out what you see over here is the Gemara is going to talk about essentially 4 different categories of chatas. What are the 4 categories of chatas? Chatas of a nazir. Right? Remember again, a Nazir at the end of his Nazirite vow brings a chatas. Rabbi say, just as an aside, why does the Nazir bring a chatas? Why does he bring a chatas? Because at the end of the day, he prohibited something to himself that is permitted. In other words, anything HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to have, he said, don't have it. If he didn't say, don't have it, then effectively he's saying, enjoy it. Just enjoy it responsibly. The Nazir is asering wine onto himself. That is interest, as much as he's doing it for a good reason, to amplify his personalistic holiness. There is an element of sinfulness, because why are you permitting something that's permitted? So that's the chatas of the Nazir. That's one. Number 2 is the chatas of the Mitzora, which makes sense that he's bringing a chatas because, again, saras always comes about because of some type of sinful behavior. The other 2 cases that the Gemara is going to reference is chatas chelev and chatas dam. If you ate chelev accidentally, forbidden fat, you'll bring a chatas, or if you ate blood accidentally, you'll bring a chatas as well. So now watch this. So the Gemara says, mechada lo asya. It could very well be that in order to learn out this halacha, that a chatas requires the shma. The shma, both by carbonic designation as well as the shma by ownership designation, can't be learned out from one example. Maybe tisi chadam itarti. Maybe we can learn it out from two examples together. So the Gemara says, "Bahai lo lichtov." So which one do we not have to mention? The Gemara says, "Lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas chelev v'teisi mihanach." So maybe don't say anything by chatas chelev, but learn out chatas chelev from the other cases. The Gemara says, "Here's the problem. I can't learn chatas chelev from chatas mitzora and chatas nazir. Why? Malahanach shekin yesh iman daim acherin." Shabam, here's the problem. Chatas Misora and Chatas Nazir both have other accompanying karbanos. So therefore, again, perhaps they can serve as a source of lishma for the other cases. So the Gemara says, Lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas. Lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas Nazir. Right. Lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas Nazir v'tisi mihanach. So again, therefore, perhaps we'll say like this. Don't do anything by chatas nazir, and let's learn chatas nazir from the other cases. Ma lahanach shekein ein lahen sheila. So this is very interesting. The other cases do not have revocation. Look at Rashi. Rashi points out over here, sheila nazir nishal chacham va'okir nazira sofatim in a karban. A nazir, technically speaking, could have revocation of his vow. And if he has revocation, that can retroactively uproot the vow and exempt him from carbonic liability or responsibility. So lo lichtov rachmana b'chatas mitzora. So don't say b'chatas mitzora v'teisi mihanach. Learn from the other cases. Malahanach shekein ein ba'in b'dalos. In these other cases, Rabbi say there is no substitute carbon in case the individual is impoverished. Ela amar kra. Rabbi say, so what you see from here is we're trying to figure out what is the source case to teach me that lishma is an indispensable necessity by chatos. So the Gemara says, "Ela Amar Kra Zos HaTorah the Ola Mincha." Rather, Rabbi say the pasuk says like this, and remember we've quoted this pasuk a number of times already. The pasuk in its entirety is Zos HaTorah La Ola La Mincha Vela Chatas Vela Asham Vela Miluim Ula Zevach Hashlamim. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Hikisha Kasav L'Shlamim." What do you see from here? That the Torah goes ahead and equates all karbanos, Ola Mincha Chatas, Asham, and Miluim to Shlamim. So what does that equation teach me? Mashlam bein shinui kodesh bein shinui bailim ba'inam l'shma l'mitzvah avchatas bein shinui kodesh bein shinui bailim ba'inam l'shma l'mitzvah. So we'll say now watch this. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says, just like shlamim requires l'shma. Now again, we'll say what kind of l'shma does shlamim require? Two levels of l'shma. L'shma ownership l'shma, or I should say carbonic designation l'shma, and ownership l'shma. But I will say, but by shlamim, and therefore again, just as shlamim requires it, so too all of these other karbanos require it. But there's only one problem, which is it's lemitzvah. Lemitzvah means what? L'chatchila. L'chatchila. So what I learned from this is very important. It's very important. So this pasuk teaches me by equating chatas to shlamim, just like shlamim requires l'shma in both elements of l'shma, l'chatchila. So too chatas requires l'shma. So the Gemara says, Hilchach mitzvah mishlamim, v'hanach kroi la'akev. Interesting, I will say. The rest of these psukim that we mentioned, all the pchatos so psukim, teach me that what? That not only is l'shma required l'chatchila, but ultimately, again, it's ma'akev. It's required even b'diavad, and therefore not having l'shma by any cases of chatos, whether it's the ownership l'shma or carbonic designation l'shma, will fundamentally compromise the carbon. So we'll say it's actually quite a beautiful limud if you think about it. So therefore, the idea that chatos has to have l'shma l'chatchila is actually learned out from shlamim. And then the additional psukim that we just mentioned before, all these chatos so psukim teach me that chatos requires l'shma even b'diavad, and failure to do so fundamentally undermines the effectiveness of the carbon. Incredible. Now I understand this is true by chatos of chelev, because it says lechatos. Chatas ta'avos kol chavim. The shmias kol bitu isvasayim tumas mikdash vekadashav. The lo ksiv behu minalan. So Rabbi says it's very interesting. So I understand ultimately again in any case where the Torah is going to say lechatos that it's going to apply, because even lashon of lechatos teaches me again that it's ma'akev. What about all these other cases, all these other carbon chatas, a chatas for avodah zara, a chatas shmias karabosa, is again where you hear an oath and you answer amen to it, bitois asayim, where you articulate the shvuah, tumas mikdash v'kadasha, either again you enter into the mikdash in a state of tumah, or ultimately again consume kodesh in a state of tumah. All of these cases of chatas, the lo ksiv behu, where there's no mention per se of like lechatas, ultimately, again, minalan. How do I know that halacha l'maisa in these cases you need lishma by their chatos, and failure to have that undermines the effectiveness of the carbon? To which the Gemara says, chatas ta'avodas kochavim asya mechatas chelev. So the chatas of, at least for the chatas of avodah zarah, that's not from chelev. Shekin kares kamosa, because ultimately, because just like chelev has a chi of kares, avodah zarah is a chi of kares, and therefore, just like the chatas of chelev needs to be the shema, so too the chatas of avodah zarah has to be the shema. What about these other cases? V'hanach kulo asma ma'atzad, and all of these other cases of chatas will simply be learned. Rabbi say ma'atzad is like a common denominator. Well, we learned that from common denominator. So Rabbi say that ends the sugya. So bottom line, halacha l'maisa. What do we have? So first of all, interestingly enough, what we have is like this. Let's first start with the ruling. So the ruling is that a chatas must be offered up l'shma. What type of lishma? Two categories of lishma. Ownership lishma for the sake of the right owner, and carbonic lishma for the sake of the right carbon. Failure to do so by a chatas makes the chatas pasul. The carbon itself is fundamentally pasul, not good. Not only does it not count towards the obligation of the owner, but halacha l'maisa again, the carbon itself is invalid. Where do I learn that from? So it seems like the bottom line limud where the Gemara settles on is the fact that the Torah compares chatas to a shlamim, teaches us that just as the shlamim requires the shema in both categories, so too does a chatas. But that only teaches me that a chatas requires a lechatchila. How do I know that a chatas requires it even b'diavad? That's all of these other lashonos, chataso, lichatas, teaches us that there's an insistence ultimately again on Lishma. Incredible. Let's go back to Tan Rabbanon. Pesach Bizmanos. So now we're switching back to Karban Pesach. Because Karban Pesach was the other item that requires Lishma in both categories, L'chatchila, and failure to have Lishma in either of the categories ultimately renders the Karban unfit. So Tan Rabbanon, Pesach Bizmano Lishmo Kosher. Shalom Lishmo Pasal. Shabbos say very interesting brayse here. The Gemara says as follows: if you offer up a Karban Pesach Bizmano, Shabbos say what's Bizmano? What's Bizmano? Bizmano Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach. But I just want to point out how beautiful it is to learn. How beautiful it is to learn a Gemara on Karban Pesach on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Right? What's the pshat? I will say it's clear. It's clear. What's the message? We're going to be zocheh to offer up the Karban Pesach in the Beis Hamikdash this year. That's what Cheshbon Baruch was telling us. That's the kiss. Why else would there be a sugya of Karban Pesach on Erev Rosh Hashanah? It must be ultimately, again, that this is going to be the year when finally, in Meretz Hashem, we are going to have our third Beis HaMikdash, and we are Zocheh Meretz Hashem to literally, again, V'nochal Sham min Zevachim u'min Psachim. This is going to be the year. Cheshbon Baruch was telling us, get ready. So we better learn a sugya of Karban Pesach and Erev Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara says, Pesach Bizmano L'shmo Kasher, Shalom L'shmo Pasal. If you offer up a Karban Pesach, now again, Bizmano means on Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan. If you offer it up L'shmo, for the sake of Pesach, it's Kasher. Shalom Lishmo, whatever. Shalom Lishmo means what? You offer it up for some other carbon other than a Karban Pesach. Halacha l'maaseh, it is possible. It is possible. So the Gemara says, B'shayimos Hashana. Now during the rest of the year, the Gemara says, Lishmo pasul, Shalom Lishmo kasha. It's interesting. So during the rest of the year, if you offer it up for the sake of a Karban Pesach, that is invalid. Right, because Karban Pesach is only offered once a year on the 14th of Nisan. But interestingly enough, if you offered up Shalom Lishmo, now the Pashtos, Shalom Lishmo, Karban Pesach is Shlamim, because the Karban Pesach is a Karban Shlamim. During the rest of the year, it's Kasha. It's Kasha, which makes sense because it's a Shlamim. So the Gemara says, Minahani, from where do I know this? Amar Abu Lishmo, Amar Kra, because the Pasuk says, Im minatzon karbano lezevach shlamim laHashem. The pasuk says, if your carbon will come from the sheep, lezevach shlamim laHashem. So now what we're asking over here is, during the rest of the year, how do I know that if you offer up a Karban Pesach shalom lishmo, right, that not for Karban Pesach, but for shlamim, that it's going to be kosher? So the Gemara says, davar haba minatzon lezevach shlamim, teaches us anything that comes from the sheep has the ability to be a shlamim. So essentially, a Karban Pesach offered up shalom lishmo during the year just becomes a regular shlamim. Incredible. Sa'ai ema shlamim in midi achrin alo. So 1 second. So maybe it means like this. Maybe that means like this. So maybe that's talking about a case where enachinami, if you took the Karban Pesach and during the rest of the year you shechted it for the sake of a shlamim, then enachinami, then it's kosher. But ultimately, again, if you went ahead and you shechted it for some other purpose, perhaps it should be possible. I think Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Ila, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lezevach l'rabos kol zevach. No, actually, interestingly enough, it doesn't matter what you have kavanah for. A Karban Pesach shechted shalom l'shma, whatever you're shechting it for ola, you're shechting it for shlamim, it'll still be kosher during the rest of the year. Fascinating. Ema kol b'shachet lahavi kamosa. The Gemara says, so ultimately, so why don't you say, if that's the case, whatever you have kavanah for, that should be what the carbon is used for. Now, bepashtos, anytime you shech the Pesach during the year, it becomes a shlamim. So the Gemara says, but 1 second, no matter what your kavanah is, it's kasher for a shlamim. But why? Why don't we say whatever your kavanah is, that's what the carbon becomes? So if you have in mind that the Pesach should be an olah during the rest of the year, then it should be an olah. If it would have said l'shlamim v'zevach, then I would have agreed with you. Hashta d'chsiv l'zevach shlamim, but now that it says l'zevach shlamim, what does that mean? L'kol d'shachet le shlamim lehavi. It teaches me that when a Karban Pesach is offered up during the rest of the year, shalom l'shmo, not for the sake of shlamim, it automatically becomes a shlamim. Not for the sake of Pesach, it automatically becomes a shlamim. So I want to just point out what's happening over here. So when you shecht a Karban Pesach during the rest of the year, whatever as long as you don't have kavanah for Karban Pesach, you're good to go. Whatever you have kavanah for, right, the carbon is fine. But interestingly enough, whatever you have kavanah for, what is the carbon going to become? It is going to be a carbon shlamim. Incredible, incredible. So the Gemara says, Ema lezevach klal shlamim prat, klal prat. But why don't we say this? Why don't we say lezevach is a klal, a general term. Shlamim is a prat, is a specific term. Klal prat, and I have a klal and a prat. Ein bechlal elamash beprat. Ultimately, again, the only thing in the klal, right? The klal is modified ultimately by the prat. So the Gemara says, why don't we say this? Shlamim min midachrin lo. It can only be offered up for shlamim, not anything else. To which the Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, La Hashem hadar v'kalal. There's another. It's really a klal uprat to klal because Hashem is at the end. So the Gemara says, Maskifla Rabbi Yaakov minar pekod ha lo dami klala basra the klala kama. Here's the problem. The second klal ultimately again does not match the first klal. To which the Gemara says, klala kama marbi Zevachim esulo. Ultimately, again, the first klal comes to go ahead and include other karbanos. Klala basra la Hashem. Called la Hashem vafilu laofos vafilu labenachos. Shabbos says, so the first klal teaches me any type of animal carbon. The second klal la Hashem would seem to indicate that it's any type of carbon, even menachos, even meal offerings, even birds. To which the Gemara says, Hatana di Rabbi Shmuel beklali uprati darish ki gavna. Shabbos, we actually saw this, if you remember again, in the beginning of the Masechta, about whether or not, generally, in a klalu pratu klal, the two klals are the bookends. The two klals are the bookends. Shabbos, I say, interestingly enough, generally, those two bookends are supposed to resemble each other. And if they don't, you generally can't darshan a klalu pratu klal. But the Gemara ever says that Tana de Rabbi Shmuel ultimately darshans a klalu pratu klal, even when the second klal does not match the first. So Shabbos, I just want to point out what just happened, and it's very important. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says like this: if carbon Pesach, in general, on Erev Pesach, if it's offered up l'shem Pesach, it's good. If it's offered up shalom b'shmo, not for the sake of Pesach, then what? It's invalid. And not only does it not count towards the owner, but it's fundamentally invalid. During the rest of the year, if halacha l'maisa, again, it is offered up l'shem Pesach, it's invalid. If it's offered up for anything else, ultimately it's valid. But no matter what kavanah you have for that Pesach during the rest of the year, it is automatically designated as a carbon shlamim. That is the halacha ultimately, again, with Karban Pesach. I'll just point out something so beautiful over here. If you notice, so this will conclude, if you notice, that halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, this klalu pratu klal, the last klal was Hashem. So the Gemara says, the first klal over here just includes, right, the first klal just includes Zevachim, animal karbanos. The last klal, Hashem, includes everything. See, I was saying, when you have the Ribono Shel Olam, you have everything. Right? Hashem, by definition, includes everything. That last column includes everything. When you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ribbon Shalom is marba everything. This is what David HaMelech says in the David Hashem. We've been saying it every single day. Achos sha'alti me'es Hashem osa v'akesh. Ribbon Shalom, I have one request. One request and one request only. Shifti beveis Hashem kol yemei chayai. Let me dwell in the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all my days. And the Mefarshim ask, David, that's your only request? You only have one request? What about Parnasa? What about a livelihood? Right now, granted, he's king. It's one of the perks of the job. You have a lot of money, right? Brother Maisa, still, right? What about Parnasa? What about health? What about Shalom Bayis? What about children? All things that David, right? We always say the one thing that David HaMelech did not struggle with was money, but every single thing else he did struggle with. So what do you mean you only have one request, Shifti Beveis Hashem? So the Malbim says so beautifully, because David HaMelech understood the core central truth of life, that if you have Hashem, you have everything. It doesn't mean you have all the money you want, all the refuah you want, all the shalom you want. But if you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu in your life, then by definition, you have everything you need in life to be successful. Achos sha'alti me'es Hashem osa v'akesh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just give me one thing. Just let me have relationship with you. Because if I could have that, I know some way, somehow, everything else is going to be good. Why? Because it's an explicit Gemara Maseches Zevachim, Daf Ches Amud Beis. Klala Basra was HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What is it marbe? Ultimately, again, La Hashem, Kol de La Hashem. Hashem is marbe everything. When you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you have everything. And Rabosai, what a way to finish off the daf is going to Rosh Hashanah. Because at the end of the day, our entire avodah on Rosh Hashanah, the entire avodah of this day, is to reignite our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not about even asking for stuff. It's not even about asking for life. It's not about asking for forgiveness. It's about asking for Hashem. Ribono shel olam, all I ask for is for you. I just want you. Achos sha'alti me'es Hashem. Because if I have you, la Hashem, kol de la Hashem. When you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu, indeed you have everything. Rabbi Osai, we'll stop over here for today. By the way, okay, 34 minutes, just saying, 34 minutes, okay? Osai, shukr everyone. I know a little fast. I'll say it's schus Baruch Hashem as we close out this year. It's schus to learn with all of you, Baruch Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should just give us many years of learning and growth together. All right, Chevra on Zoom. Have a good Eretz Yisrael, Chevra. What a schus Baruch Hashem to be also with all of you this year. Halavai. I hope that this is the last year that we are in Zoom, or maybe if it's in Zoom, and Meretz Hashem, I'm coming over to you. We'll have the live share in Eretz Yisrael and Meretz Hashem. We have to zoom back to America. We'll do that. How that should be zilchik. See the everyone.
Good group.
It is a good group. That's